Magic has a lot of weird cards with very complex and weird interactions. So many that we couldn't even come close to covering them all in a single top 10 list. Now that it's been quite a while since our last video on the subject, it's worth once again asking the question, what are the biggest ruling nightmares in all of Magic? Starting us off at number 10, we have Obeka, Brood Chronologist. This is a 3/4 legendary ogre wizard with a mana cost of 1, 1 blue, black, and 1 red. It has the very simple ability where whoever's turn it is may choose to end the turn. While on paper this ability is simple, in practice it requires quite a bit of work to describe how this actually functions. There's a reason Obeka has that long piece of reminder text after all. On top of the turn ending, this ability will exile all spells and abilities on the stack, which is where most of the strange and niche rulings from Obeka come from. The most obvious use of this is that if your opponent targets a creature you control with removal, you can activate Obeka to end the turn, and the removal spell won't resolve. In this way, Obeka is a strange form of protection. However, this is only the tip of the iceberg in terms of what Obeka can do. Let's say you cast Ideas Unbound, a sorcery for 2 mana that lets you draw 3 cards, then discard 3 cards at the end of the turn. When Obeka ends the turn, it isn't creating an end step or anything like that, so these kinds of effects won't trigger. However, this usually won't do all that much for you. If you cast Ideas Unbound and then just end the turn, Ideas will just trigger at the end of the next turn, so you'll still have to discard 3 cards. The card says to discard at the next end step, and the next end step to occur is your opponent's end step. So are we just out of luck? Well, no. If you wait until the end of your turn and let Ideas Unbound trigger and try to make you discard cards, you can activate Obeka in response. When the turn ends, Unbound won't trigger or anything as we previously mentioned. However, when the end of the next turn rolls around, even though Ideas Unbound's lingering trigger never resolved, that end step is no longer the next end step that the original Ideas Unbound cared about. Essentially, by timing Obeka's activation ability properly, you can skip certain detrimental triggers. Of course, this does get a bit technical, as this doesn't just skip any end of turn effects. As you can see in Obeka's reminder text, the ability she has does cause until the end of turn, and this turn effects to wear off. So if you use a card like Threaten to gain control of something, ending the turn with Obeka will always cause you to lose control of it no matter when you activate it. The rule for when Obeka can be used to get around end of turn style effects depends on if it's a delayed trigger or not. The exact wording will usually be something like at the beginning of the next end step, and most end of turn effects will work as normal. Now, while all of this is a bit complicated, it's nothing too crazy. Most experienced players will either be familiar with these rulings, or be able to intuit them once you walk them through parts of the process, or maybe just once they look at all the cards next to each other. The reason why Obeka is on this list is that to play the card properly, you have to pay very close attention to these kinds of rulings. Obeka is a popular commander, and all of the commander decks with her are built around abusing these kinds of interactions to skip turns with Glorious End, or other cards with detrimental effects at the end of the turn. A new player will probably not understand how anything those decks are built to do even works. Obeka is one of only a few cards in Magic that requires this level of understanding of rules to play properly. Now, you'll always do better the more you understand about the game and the more rulings you know, but most decks and cards can be played with a very 101 understanding. Obeka decks just don't make any sense unless you have knowledge of these rulings. And at number 9, we have Lich's Mirror. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 5. It has the ability where, if you would lose the game, instead you shuffle your hand, all cards in your graveyard, and all permanents you own into your deck, shuffle and draw 7 cards. Then your life total becomes 20. Now, Lich's Mirror is, by itself, not a difficult card to resolve. Cards that stop you from losing the game, such as Platinum Angel and Stunning Reversal, aren't the most common thing ever, but they do prop up frequently enough that most players have become acquainted with how to resolve them. However, Lich's Mirror has a very specific difference to most other similar cards that makes it do some very weird things. Cards like the Golden Throne and Exquisite Archangel both exile themselves whenever they try to save you, so you don't just become unkillable. Probably because wizards learn their lessons with Mirror. Rather than exiling itself, Mirror shuffles itself back into your deck as part of its effect. Except, it doesn't necessarily do that. Rather than say shuffle Mirror into its owner's library, it just relies on the whole shuffling all permanents you own into your deck to do that for you. But what if you don't actually own Lich's Mirror? If you steal Lich's Mirror with an effect like Confiscation Coup and then you lose the game, you'll get to restart the game with Lich's Mirror on the field. This has the effect of, well, making it impossible for you to ever lose the game, which is bad enough on its own. However, this gets much worse if the reason you lost the game wasn't due to having 0 life. For an example, let's say you have 10 poison counters thanks to Infect. You see, while Mirror does reset your life total to 20, along with just about everything else, it won't change the number of poison counters you have on you. After Lich's Mirror finishes replacing you losing the game with resetting you to 7 cards in hand, if you stole it from an opponent and have 10 or more poison counters, state-based actions will check again and see that you should lose the game once again. This will, of course, cause Lich's Mirror effect to come into play once again, which will replace you losing the game with the whole shuffling thing once again, but that won't get rid of your poison counters, so as soon as it's done, Lich's Mirror will replace you losing the game yet again. We find ourselves in yet another infinite loop, but this one is quite special. You see, unlike most loops, such as giving someone a Box Serpent with an assault suit attached to it while they don't have a swamp, most of these loops require an ability triggering infinitely, which of course uses the stack. The Lich's Mirror loop, however, happens as state-based action, meaning it does not use the stack. What this means is that you can't respond to it happening, as players never get priority. If you cause this loop to happen, the game won't only be forced to end in a draw, but there's practically no way to stop it from happening. Even a naturalized effect won't save you. Lich's Mirror is, for the most part, a pretty simple card, but it's one of the few cards that can truly grind the entire game to a standstill with only a bit of setup, even if it's very unlikely for it to happen in a game. And at number 8, we have Vadrok, Apex of Thunder. This is a 3/3 legendary elemental dinosaur cat with a mana cost of 1 blue, 1 red, and 1 white. It has flying and first strike, so it can't be blocked by non-flying creatures, and deals combat damage before other creatures. And it has mutate for 1 white or blue, and 2 red mana. This means that you can pay this cost and target a non-human creature you own, then put it either on top or below that creature. They become one creature with the stats of the topmost creature card, but all of the abilities of every card mutated onto that creature. Finally, it has the ability where, when this creature mutates, you can cast target non-creature spell from your graveyard with a mana value of 3 or less without paying its mana cost. Now, a big part of the reason Vadrok is on this list is because it has the mutate mechanic, which is one of the most confusing mechanics in the game. Mutate, making several creatures into one creature, has a lot of weird interactions that you kinda just have to be told. For example, if the mutated creature would leave the field, all of the cards mutated on it go there, but then they stop being the same creature. If that creature dies, it only counts as one creature dying, but multiple creature cards will be put into your graveyard. If you blink a mutated creature, they'll get exiled, then return to the field as different creatures instead of one creature, which isn't exactly intuitive. Worst of all, logistically, all of the abilities a creature gains from mutate can be copied by a clone effect. This means you can clone a mutated creature, then mutate onto either that clone or the original creature, and then copy that creature again, and you have to remember when you clone the creature to know what abilities and stats it should have. Famously, this is also the only way to have a non-commander in your commander zone. If you mutate onto your commander, and then it gets sucked up by a leadership vacuum, well, all of the mutated cards go to the same zone. So your commander and the mutated cards go to the command zone. You can't cast the mutated card though, so it just kind of is stranded there for the rest of the game. Not really that problematic, but very funny. The only problematic card to mutate inherently is the cloning thing, and that's just a logistical issue at the end of the day. The rules are all straightforward, it's just a nightmare to actually track. However, Vadrok is here for a very specific reason, as it has some really interesting interactions. Specifically with the card Chef's Kiss. This is an instant with a mana cost of 1 and 2 red with the effect where you gain control of target spell with a single target. You copy that spell, then choose new targets for the spell and the copy at random, and the targets must be an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls. Now, Chef's Kiss doesn't say what type of card it has to copy, so it can technically copy a creature spell that's targeting something, which is what a mutate card is. So, if you tried to mutate Vadrok onto something, you can use Chef's Kiss to get a copy of Vadrok, but then we run into an issue. When Chef's Kiss tries to reselect targets for the spell, there won't be any valid targets, as mutate has to target a creature you own. This means that no matter the target you select, you will either be going against Chef's Kiss's restriction or the mutate restriction. So what happens? Well, as we can see in the gathering rules for Chef's Kiss, if Chef's Kiss would force an illegal target, then the target just remains unchanged. So both copies of Vadrok will target the original creature you are mutating them onto. The reason we bring this up with Vadrok specifically is because this is actually really good for Vadrok Commander decks, as it's actually a 2-card combo. You can use the mutate trigger from one Vadrok to recast Chef's Kiss, which will give you another Vadrok that will mutate onto that creature. When it resolves, you'll get 2 triggers because you still have the mutate effect from the first Vadrok that resolved. So you can recast Chef's Kiss and any 3 mana or lower spell you have, which just wins you the game with the right card in your graveyard. So Vadrok is a card with a relevant interaction that you need to check the gathering rules to play properly. That's also a mutate card. So it keeps all of the weirdness associated with the mechanic. While not completely unmanageable, all of this means that Vadrok causes a lot of problems when it does show up. And at number 7, we have Desperate Ritual, here representing the Splice cards in general. What the Splice mechanic does is, whenever you cast a spell with the right characteristics, essentially being an arcane spell, you can reveal any number of Splice cards from your hand. That card will gain all the effects and the Splice cost of all the cards you revealed. Now, most of the time, this is very intuitive in how it works. Maybe a bit of a headache to track, but not as bad as Mutate is. However, they can let you do some really weird things by combining the right combination of alternate and additional costs. A great example is trying to cast Disrupting Shoal with the Veil of Secrecy spliced onto it. Shoal is an instant that counters any spell with a mana value of X and costs X and 2 blue. However, you can exile a blue card from your hand with a mana value of X rather than pay its mana cost. Veil's splice cost is to return a blue creature you control to your hand. Now, if we cast Disrupting Shoal targeting a 3 mana spell with a 3 mana creature on the battlefield, then if we decided to splice Veil of Secrecy onto the Shoal, the spell's cost would be to exile a 3 mana blue card from your hand and to bounce a blue creature we control. Generally speaking, you're allowed to pay the cost of spells or abilities in any order you want. So you can choose to bounce a creature, in this case our 3-drop, and then exile a blue card, which could once again be our 3 mana creature. So with both of these cards in your hand, you could cast a Shoal and splice onto it by exiling a blue creature you control, which is kind of strange. However, the splice card causes a much bigger issue for wizards behind the scenes. Why exactly? Well, back when Splice was first released, it was considered a copy effect. This spell you cast would copy the text of any spell you spliced onto it. And since copying something is itself something that can be copied, if you use a spell like Double Cast to copy a splice spell, it would keep all of the spliced effects. This is still true to this day. However, the way Splice works has changed over the years, in part because copying only part of a spell was problematic. Now, it's a text-changing effect, just like Magical Hack, which is a bit of an issue for copying them. If you magical hack a Blood Moon and then use Copy Enchantment to get a second Blood Moon, you'll make a copy of the original Blood Moon, not the one whose text has been changed. This is mostly because of memory issues that would result from being able to change the text of a card and then copy it, but we'll get into that more later. For our purposes, this means that if Splice is just a text changing ability, then the interaction with copy effects should change. So why does the copy of a Splice card keep the spliced effects? Well, another aspect of copying a spell a player is casting is that any modes you choose while casting that spell stay the same. So if you choose to draw 2 and lose 2 life off of an Abzan Charn, any copies of that spell will be copying the draw mode, and they can't select any of the other modes instead. As weird as it sounds, splicing a card onto another card is basically treated like a mode of that spell. Just as the game remembers what decision was made when casting a modal spell, the game will remember what decisions you made in terms of splicing a spell, and those decisions will then affect the text of the spell. This way, the copy ruling stays exactly the same, despite the fact the justification for why has changed completely. This is one of the most niche rulings in all of Magic, mostly because the ruling changed from what it was to the exact same outcome. The only thing that changed was the reason why that was the correct answer. And at number 6, we have Dryad Arbor. This is a 1/1 Dryad Forest creature land, and that basically sums up the entire card. As a forest land, it can tap for green mana, and can be played from your hand as a land drop, or put onto the field by any effects that find lands, such as Hour of Promise. However, it was also just a 1/1 creature, so it can attack and block, and was affected by Summoning Sickness. This means you couldn't tap it for mana right away, which is kind of a big downside. Arbor is also the only land creature in the game, which means that it's been at the center of a lot of weird interactions. The most famous concerns a scandal that happened at the Grand Prix. Here's the TLDR. Player A controlled a Flameblade Adept, which had enough power to attack for lethal and has menace, so it has to be blocked by at least 2 creatures. and player B only has one creature. Since their opponent was dead, player A attacked with Flameblade. Player B blocks with the creature they had and an untapped Dryad Arbor near the back of their battlefield with all of their other lands, costing player A the game. When people saw this, they were livid. The fact that a game in the future could be decided by a simple miscommunication, or worse, someone purposefully hiding a Dryad Arbor under one of their other lands to try and surprise block out of nowhere. Whatever the case, the idea that players would be ambushed by a hard-to-spot Dryad was a big enough issue that Wizards changed the tournament rules to account for this. After this event, players were required to put any creature lands up with their creatures, not in the back with their lands for the purpose of clarity. Now, usually we wouldn't bring up something like this for a rulings video, as this is more of a tournament policy as opposed to a rulings issue. But it was famous enough that if we didn't mention it, people would probably be talking about it in the comments. Dryad Arbor has some more interesting interactions, such as with cards like Worms of the Earth. This is a 5-mana enchantment with the abilities where players can't play lands, and lands can't enter the battlefield. It also has an effect that allows players to get rid of it, but that's not important here. Now, Arbor and Worms of the Earth interact how you'd think for the most part. You can't play Arbor with Worms out, and any effects like Sakura Tribe Scout that would put it onto the field without you playing it can't work. This covers most cases, but not all of them. If Dryad Arbor and Worms are on the field and a player casts a clone, you can have it choose to enter the battlefield as a copy of Dryad Arbor. This is where a problem shows up. The clone will be trying to enter as a Dryad Arbor, which Worm prevents. Normally, a card in this position will just stay in whatever zone it was previously, but that's not an option here. It's not like it can just go back into the stack and stay there forever. Luckily for us, there's a ruling that can help us here. Rather than enter the field, the game puts the clone into the graveyard, presumably because there's just nowhere else it can go without messing something up. This is more of a Worms of the Earth ruling than a Dryad Arbor ruling, but Arbor is one of the only ways that you can cause something like this to happen. Honestly, it's probably only a matter of time until something weird happens because of Dryad Arbor being the only creature land in the game again. And at number 5, we have Volrath Shapeshifter. This is a 0/1 Shapeshifter with a mana cost of 1 and 2 blue. It is the ability where you can pay 2 to discard a card. It also has the ability where as long as the top card of your graveyard is a creature card, Shapeshifter has the full text of that card, except it keeps the ability to pay mana to discard. Shapeshifter is just a complete nightmare of a card. First off, it's a graveyard order card, which is already a huge pain to deal with as a player and requires knowing a couple of extra rulings that you never need to know unless someone's playing one of these cards. Graveyard order is such a niche mechanic and is such a pain to deal with that on MTG Go, the game won't even track graveyard order unless one of the players is playing a card that cares about it. Of course, this isn't enough to get Shapeshifter onto this list alone. Volrath Shapeshifter is the only card in the entire game that can copy an entire text box, which is why it has its own rule in the rulebook describing how this works. Basically, this is a copy in effect in all but name, but it can't be a copy effect for some very specific and weird reasons. Those reasons have to do with layers, and you knew these were going to come up eventually. Layers are how the game decides how to apply multiple continuous effects, which allows us to fix a ton of weird board states. The first 3 layers are copy effects, then control determining effects, then text changing effects. The issue is that if Volrath was a copy effect, we would determine what it was copying in layer 1. Then it would change control in layer 2, so Volrath would always be copying the top card of its owner's library regardless of who controls it. To get around this issue, they made it a text changing effect that applies in layer 3, after control changing effects. However, this caused a ton of other issues. For an example, let's say you have a clone as a top card of your graveyard. When you cast Volrath Shapeshifter, it will have the text of the clone, and normally you would try to apply all the replacement effects of any card whose text Shapeshifter is stealing. However, copying effects like clone apply in layer 1, as we said, and Volrath Shapeshifter doesn't get the text of a card until layer 3. This means that Shapeshifter won't have the copy ability as it enters, so it can't clone anything. However, it will still copy clone stats, name, type, etc., meaning it will be a 0/0. This will cause the Shapeshifter to instantly die once it enters. This is only the tip of the iceberg, of course. Shapeshifter has a ton of other scenarios that are difficult to rule or just generally confusing. For example, if you have a Shapeshifter and a Psychotog on the field, or any card that exiles cards from your graveyard as costs, you can exile cards to change what the top card of your graveyard is, and have the Shapeshifter instantly change its properties. This can let it go from being a Phyrexian Devourer to a Nimble Mongoose without your opponent even having the chance to respond, which makes playing against the card a nightmare, even if you already understand all of the weird rulings the card has. This example is especially relevant because Volrath Shapeshifter is actually quite a good card in certain contexts. It's playable in the pre-modern format, a fan-favorite format with cards from 4th edition to Scourge, and can be good in formats like Commander. Volrath Shapeshifter is basically a walking headache, and unfortunately, it's powerful enough that we can't just ignore its existence. And at number 4, we have Goblin Test Pilot. This is a 0/2 Goblin Wizard with a mana cost of 1, 1 blue, and 1 red. It has flying and the ability where you can tap it to have the pilot deal 2 damage to any target chosen at random. Now, this seems like a card that makes perfect sense until you think about what happens with cards like Opala, Warden of Waves on the field that increases the cost of activating this kind of ability. On their own, neither of these cards are problematic, but together they become a headache because Goblin chooses its target randomly. Let's imagine that you have a test pilot and your opponent has Opala. There are no other creatures on field, and you're tapped out. You activate Test Pilot, and it can target either player itself or the Opala. If it targets either player or itself, everything is fine. But if it targets Opala, the cost of activating the ability goes up, and you no longer have the required mana to use Test Pilot. So, are you allowed to activate Test Pilot? The answer is yes, but there is a lot of nuance here. If you activate the Test Pilot and it hits anything besides Opala, everything works as normal. However, if you target Opala, the activation becomes illegal and you have to rewind before Test Pilot activated. You are then free to activate Test Pilot again and choose another random target. And this is where things get very weird. The line between innocently trying to use your Test Pilot properly and abusing rulings is very thin here. Looking at a similar interaction, if a player controls a Basalt Monolith, they can tap it for 3 mana, and then use the same mana to untap the Monolith with its own ability. You can technically do this any number of times, but doing so will quickly be declared slow play in a game, as you're not advancing the game state. While not exactly the same, if we have a Test Pilot and a Opala out, and every target besides Opala can't be targeted for some reason, such as gaining hexproof, activating Test Pilot and not paying over and over would be disallowed for a similar reason. So, if you roll Opala several times in a row while there are other valid targets, is that slow play? What if there are more merfolk and most of the targets would be illegal in this scenario? How unlikely does it have to be for Test Pilot to actually resolve for you to be allowed to activate it again? Do we just shortcut past all of this? To be perfectly honest, I have no idea what the ruling would be. This is where tournament policy and actual ruling start to collide, which is outside of my wheelhouse. If you're playing this card, I would suggest just asking the head judge at an event how to resolve the issue, or asking your friends in a commander pod for what you all think is a fair way to rule a card. Don't try to rule shark anyone with it, that's for sure. Regardless, the card leads to a lot of issues that you have to work really hard to engineer otherwise. And at number 3, we have Dress Down. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 1 and 1 blue. It has Flash, letting you cast it at instant speed, and the ability where, when it enters, you draw a card. Creatures lose all abilities, and at the beginning of the end step, you sacrifice this card. Dress Down isn't the only magic that takes abilities away from cards, but it's probably the most high profile. Removing abilities from cards has a lot of weird interactions. A famous one is cards like Magus of the Moon, which is a creature with the ability where all non-basic lands are mountains. Now, a plain reading of the card would lead you to think that Dress Down would take away Magus's ability, and therefore all lands would keep their original types. However, in actuality, the truth is far more complicated. This is yet another place where we need to check layers to see how effects should resolve. Magus's ability is a type-changing ability, meaning it applies in Layer 4, while ability granting and removing effects apply in Layer 6. As we decide what effects should apply, we apply the type changing in Layer 4, and then remove the ability in Layer 6. Despite the fact that it no longer has the ability, Magus of the Moon is still able to make all non-basics mountains. You may think this is a very unintuitive and stupid ruling, and you'd be correct, but there is a good reason it works like this. If we didn't have these kinds of rulings, we'd be trying to determine how effects resolve using only timestamps, and would end up with a lot more game states that just couldn't properly be represented. However, that's not at all the worst ruling involving Dress Down. It also has a really difficult ruling with everyone's favorite problem-causing bird, Nadu Winged Wisdom. Nadu gives all creatures an ability that triggers when they become the target of a spell or an ability twice per turn. Dress Down will, of course, remove this ability from all the creatures, but the strange thing is what happens after Dress Down is removed. If you target a creature with a spell or ability twice and trigger the ability twice, and then dress down enters and then subsequently leaves the field, can the ability trigger again? You see, Nadu's ability gives all creatures an ability that cares about how many times it's triggered. When Nadu loses that ability and regains it, it's not clear if the abilities it gives are the same instance of that ability or not, compared to if Nadu left the battlefield and re-entered again, as that would allow you to target the creature to trigger the ability 2 more times that turn. This is because the Nadu that leaves and re-enters is now a new object, with no memory of its previous existence. This is not true of a creature with an ability similar to Nadu's, such as Morbid Opportunist, with Dress Down in this scenario. However, Nadu's ability is one step removed from the Morbid Opportunist example, as Nadu has an ability that grants an ability, so it's not clear if the ability it grants is considered connected to the same object after Nadu loses and regains his ability. As far as I know, there is not a current ruling on this that is conclusive. Judges tend to trend towards Nadu not giving you extra triggers, though we are waiting on clarification from Wizards to get this fixed. We will get this cleaned up at some point, we just have to wait for the rules managers at Wizards to go over all the details and come to a ruling that can work in every future situation like this. And speaking of that, hello, Futurologs here. After the video was written, we actually did receive a ruling on Nadu. The abilities Nadu grants in the situation we described, the ability is in fact considered the same instance of the ability, so it will not be allowed to trigger multiple times. We know this thanks to a tweet from a rules manager at Wizards, and hopefully this ruling will be codified into the comprehensive rules in the future. Anyway, sorry for the interruption. And at number 2, we have Ertai's Meddling. This is an instant with a mana cost of X and 1 blue. It has the effects where X can't be 0, and you exile target spells with X delay counters on it. During its owner's upkeep, they remove a delay counter from that card, and when the last is removed, they put it onto the stack as a copy of the original spell. To be clear, this is not recasting the spell, it just copies it and puts it right onto the stack. The uneroded version of this card's text was actually much worse, as it just said that the spell resolved, making it at the time the only card in Magic that could make a spell resolve a card's effect. Now, there are other cards that can copy spells, such as Fork, but they only really copy spells that are already being cast. Cards like Demi-Lich that copy spells not being cast instruct you to cast the copy, because you're not really supposed to be able to put a card onto the stack without casting it. This means you can do very weird things with Ertai's Meddling, like cast a 1-mana spell into a card like Chalice of the Void with 1 counter on it, then Ertai's Meddling to exile it, and then just get the spell back next turn without casting it. This would effectively get around Chalice of the Void's ability to counter a spell of a certain mana value, which you can't really do otherwise. There's also the fact that this puts the spell onto the stack as a copy of the original spell, which has a lot of weird interactions. For one, you need to remember exactly what was happening with the spell when it got exiled. That spell will have the same targets, and if it's a modal spell, it will have the same modes chosen as well. This can be difficult to track if you cast Meddling with a large value for X. However, the card has the strangest interactions with the Morph mechanic. If you cast a Morph as a face down 2/2 and then it gets hit by a Meddling, it would get exiled face up. However, when you remove the last counter, it gets put onto the stack as a copy of the spell you cast it as, which is a face down 2/2. So, this spell you get is a face-up creature that's colorless, nameless 2/2 creature with no abilities that can no longer be flipped face-up for its morph cost. This is, to my knowledge, the only way to cause this to happen in the game. The fact that this is supposedly the fixed version of the card is kind of terrifying. And at number 1, we have Equinox. This is an aura enchantment with a mana cost of 1 white. It has Enchant Land and the ability where you can tap the enchanted land to counter target spell if it would destroy a land you control. Now, the problem with this card should be obvious to some, as there's a reason we don't have cards that counter spells that would have a specific outcome in Magic. It can be very difficult to tell what should count for Equinox effect, and most of the time it kind of comes down to just winging it. Some examples are easy. Stone Rain targeting one of your lands? Yes, this is a spell that destroys one of your lands as its effect, so it can be countered. How about an Avalanche Riders? Well, it does destroy a land with its enters effect, but the spell itself isn't destroying a land. The spell is becoming a creature that then targets an ability that destroys a land, so Equinox can't counter it. Okay, that's fine. It can only counter instants and sorceries then. However, if there's a chance that, if on the resolution of a spell, a land you control won't be destroyed, Equinox will not work. If someone casts a Wild Swing targeting 2 of your lands and 1 permanent that isn't one of your lands, well, there's an outcome of that spell that won't destroy a land you control, so you can't counter it with Equinox. Similarly, if a card like Lava Blister is targeting one of your lands, because it's possible for that spell to resolve and not destroy one of your creatures, it cannot be countered by Equinox. Even if you only have 5 or less life and taking that damage from Blister would be lethal, the spell can resolve without destroying one of your lands, so Equinox will just let it happen. This may make the effect of Equinox sound pretty dumb, but it's actually quite smart in certain situations. If you have a land creature like Dryad Arbor and someone tries to cast Murder on it, it will be able to counter that murder because the result of murder resolving is a destruction of one of your lands. However, if they instead cast a lightning bolt, Equinox will not work. This is because the result of bolt is putting 3 damage onto a creature, which will then cause state-based actions to kick in and say that it needs to be put in the graveyard. Technically, lightning bolt did not destroy the creature, so it is not a valid target for the card. This level of actually being necessary for knowing how to play a very basic card effect is probably why Wizards stopped doing this kind of effect pretty quick. Cards like Unyaro Griffin, which originally had a similar effect, had their abilities eroded to something else. But Equinox wasn't for some reason, meaning it's the only card that requires this level of rules lawyering to play. Considering that this is the only card that works this way in the entire game, it easily earns itself the title of Rules Nightmare.